Okay, welcome over again to this stage, which is part of preliminary rounds of the World School Speeding Championship 2007. Though everyone knows the rules and everything, let me read quickly so you can relax yourself. Each team will have 8 minutes to make their speech. After 1 minute, the timekeeper will signal once like this. After this sound, the debaters on the other team may offer points of information to the speaker. Debaters must stand up when they offer points of information. The speaker holding the floor may choose to accept or decline a point when it is offered. At the 7-minute mark, the timekeeper will again signal once like this. After this sound, no more points of information may be offered for the rest of the speech. At the 8-minute mark, the timekeeper will make a double signal like this. After this sound, the speaker must conclude within a few seconds. There will be a short break at the end of speech for the adjudicators to complete their notes. After the 6 main speeches, each team will have the opportunity to make a 4-minute reply speech. This can be made by either the first or second speaker on the team. No points of information are allowed during reply speeches. The opposition will make their reply speech first. Before the debate begins, the audience are limited to speech, automobile phones, pagers, and anything else which might disturb the debaters. Should you need to exit or re-enter the room for any reason during the debate, please wait until the end of the speech to do so. The proposition team for this debate is the team from Lithuania. Their speaker is Yava Elivra. And their second speaker is Yava. And their third speaker is Lucas. The opposition for this debate, the team from South Korea. Their first speaker is Soi Im. Their second speaker is Arvat Hong. And their third speaker is Wonjun Zhang. The adjudicators for this debate are Mr. James Probert from England, Jennifer Hawortha from Bermuda, Mr. Christopher Sloan from Germany. The motion for this debate is, this House believes that free trade harms the developing world. I now call upon the first speaker for the proposition to articulate. Please welcome Yava Elivra.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to stand here today on the behalf of Team Proposition in favor of the motion that free trade actually does harm the developing world. And throughout my speech, I will present you with definitions of the Team Proposition, then clarify the way we see this debate, and point out the harms that we find free trade would actually bring for the developing world. Later on, present you with our team line, and then the 3 arguments that we have today. So once again, coming back to the definitions, we define free trade as an unhindered flow of goods and services between countries. Since real free trade does not really exist, we will presume that countries which have numerous free trade agreements are implementing free trade. Examples of such countries are the USA, the EU, South Korea. However, it is worth noticing that under the FTA, certain amount of protectionism, like say subsidies, is allowed. Now, developing world, we define it as poor or middle income countries based upon the average income per person. Most countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are called the developing world. Examples could be Argentina, Jamaica, Cambodia, or Indonesia. Now, the harms, ladies and gentlemen, that as a team we will prove you would be imposed in the developing world are as following. They would impede economic growth, lead to political instability, and would have a negative effect on society. Now, just some clarifications before I proceed with the arguments, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to talk about the real-life implementation of free trade and not going to be discussing a theoretical model. And secondly, we're not opposing free trade in general. Team Proposition today simply believes that it is not a good system in an early stage of development, given the current situation of the third world countries today. Now, the affirmatives have to prove that the developing countries would be better off without having free trade. And as a team, we'll prove you that free trade is a harmful model at the very early stage of development. No, thank you, madam. So our arguments are, first one, that free trade impedes economic growth of developing countries. Secondly, that weak governments are not able to handle transition to free trade. And the third argument that is going to be dealt with by our second speaker says that free trade has negative effects on society. So coming back to the first argument once again, that free trade impedes economic growth of developing countries. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Team Proposition today believes that free trade troubles domestic businesses. If we see protection as giving warranties for small, new firms, especially in less developed countries, we see that new little firms as of today could not compete with the markets in the developed countries, simply because they would not handle the competition with the firms that were located already in the developed countries once again. Developed country firms have been in this business for quite a while, and so they have been able to improve their efficiency in production. And if we force to compete those markets of the developing countries with the ones from the already developed ones, the less developed country firms would be unable to produce profitably and thus could not remain in the business. Now, we can have the examples of how opening market to milk from the USA destroyed the local milk business in Jamaica, or how almost all economic spheres in China are controlled by huge multinational corporations, giving a backseat to Chinese local businesses. So this being said, we conclude that small businesses in developing countries would be terminated because they would be unable to compete with the international corporations. No, thank you, sir. Now, secondly, Team Proposition believes that we use protectionism in industries where we see potential. Let's say protection in those less developed countries would be probably held in the form of import tariffs. So if we increase the prices of the local products sufficiently and decrease the import or the goods that are brought into the country, we thus protect the goods that are produced within the country, because for the higher prices that they, just a second, madam, for the higher prices that they're going to be getting, they will be able to cover the higher expenses of production, and thus this will pay off in a span of time. Yes, ma'am.
What about the fact that many technological transfers that come from multinationals boost the domestic industry, as the case in fast food in Southeast Asia?
Well, ma'am, I believe this is not really the issue I'm addressing now. The thing is that countries and the developing countries would not have any good advantages of the multinational corporations that would enter their market, and this will be dealt with by later on in my speech, and then by the second proposition speaker. So moving on with our argument about protectionism. When you have your production costs paid off, you can then it does protect this infant industry within the country, and throughout the time make it able to compete with the markets of the developed countries. So when you have more experience in management, more experience in production, you can then start lowering the cost of your sales, because you have already covered the cost of your production. And then step by step gradually lower the tariffs that would mean, more imports into the country and more competition. Once again, a developing country's market is able to compete with the markets of the developed ones. So this is why we need protectionism, just to make the markets within the developing countries able to compete. For if we open up the market today, ladies and gentlemen, as I proved to you with the first point, the markets would simply not be able to compete with those markets of the already developed countries. Say, we have this classical example of Great Britain, how they used huge protectionism of their textile industry back in the 19th century. And this has helped them to establish the most become a most competitive country in the sphere of textile once again. Let's say Japan used protectionism on shipbuilding, military and textile industry. And during that period, the GDP growth raised from 1% to 8%, and was even bigger than that of the so-called Eastern Miracle, that is South Korea and Taiwan, whose GDP grew till 5.2 and 6.2%. Now we conclude that once again the developing countries should also be able to protect their infant industries to make them competitive. Now this being said, I move on to our second argument, saying that young governments would be unable to handle the transition. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe it is agreeable that governments of developing countries are weak. They have bad infrastructure, little social guarantees, and hardly any institutions. So during the transition to the free trade, there is always a period when the whole infrastructure is being restructured, and that results in job losses. Let's say in India, since 2000 till the year 2004, more than 90,000 of peasants committed suicide because they were not able to handle the transition under the global pressures of multinational seed corporations. So we see, ladies and gentlemen, what detrimental effect that has. And due to that, if people are unhappy with what is happening in the country, if it leads to job losses, people are unhappy with the government. The government would be afraid to do any changes just because good benefits would not be achieved throughout their candidacy while they're in the government. And therefore, if the people are unsatisfied with the government, a lot of, like say, extremist parties would be able to take over the government. This is another disadvantage. So, ladies and gentlemen, in fine, we see that free trade at the early stage of development in the developing world would definitely impede economic growth and lead to political instability. The last harm will be presented by the second speaker. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 13 seconds.
Your speech, Elvira. And now, to open the case for the opposition, I call upon Saoyi In.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, the assumption of the first proposition speaker was that when we have protectionism, only the developing countries would have protectionism. However, if you look in the reality, when we have protectionism, the fact of the matter is that developed countries who have a significantly higher GDP will also be able to use protectionism against the developing countries. If we want to properly assess this debate, we have to draw a comparison between a world with protectionism and a world with free trade. And we say that Team Lithuania has significantly failed to assess this debate properly. So I, as first speaker, will be proving to you how free trade is fueling the economic growth in the developing world. My excellent second speaker, Albert, will deal with how protectionism drags the developing world down. My third speaker will bolster our arguments and rebut the points brought up by the honourable proposition. We as a team will prove to you that free trade opens opportunities for the developing world, whereas protectionism shuts them down. So ladies and gentlemen, with this said, I'd first like to address two major issues that came from the honourable proposition in today's debate, which was firstly the issue about how free trade harms the early stages of the developing world, and secondly on how weak governments can't handle free trade. So firstly onto the issue of how free trade harms the early stages. Now we say this is rather sneaky stance to take, because they are in a way agreeing that free trade might eventually benefit the developing world, but we'd be happy to deal with this stance anyway. Now first and foremost, I have two responses to this. Now she firstly argues that infant industries are bad, they will collapse. But the fact of the matter is the industries that are failing are often not infant industries. She brought up the example of milk in Jamaica. How long has Jamaicans used milk, ladies and gentlemen? The fact is these industries have existed for a long time, but they are simply not competitive. This was the case in proton cars in Malaysia, ladies and gentlemen. Team Lithuania is proposing that these countries use subsidies heavily on a sector that is going to fail eventually. This was also the case with the sugar industry in Philippines, an industry which sucked a lot of the taxes but eventually collapsed. We say that this argument does not stand. But a second response to this is that actually domestic companies, be them infant industries or entrenched existing industries, benefit because of the multinationals flooding into the country. This was the case in India, ladies and gentlemen, when the IT technology, which didn't used to be so competitive, burgeoned after the opening of markets. There were an opening of opportunities for the Indian youth to engage in IT technology. Yes, please.
Are you aware of the fact that most people, due to those multinational industries, have to work in the sweatshops because we are not able to work in proper conditions?
Ladies and gentlemen, last time I checked, the Indians weren't suing computers with needles. The fact is we have advanced technology going into these countries, such as in India, an example I just gave you right now. But moving on to the second argument about how weak governments can't handle free trade. Now, the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, she never really explained this in depth. All she did was she threw the example of Indian farmers committing suicide. But the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the Indian farmers committed suicide because the products that came in were heavily subsidized by the governments in the developed countries. So if the governments in the developed countries, no thank you, use subsidies, it's eventually the developing countries who don't have the ability to pay subsidies to the farmers that suffer. As I stated before, we have to have a comparative assessment. And we say that developed countries will also use subsidies and protectionist measures, which will eventually harm, just a moment, the developing world. Yes.
Are you aware of the fact that, as we said, under the current free trade agreements, actually countries are allowed to use this protectionist, and we are talking about those agreements?
No, man, that is a distortion of reality, because the WTO is working hard to cut down these developed countries who are using unfair trade measures. The WTO did this against the United States repeatedly, and the WTO is improving the free trade situation significantly. No, thank you. I've dealt with all the arguments, so now I'd like to move on to my own substantive case, in which I will explain how free trade fuels the economic growth of the developing world. And I'm going to assess this in two aspects, firstly. I'm going to firstly deal with the issue of how free trade gives access to the export markets to the developing world, and then I'll move on to my second issue, which deals with how it provides opportunities for the people living in the developing world. So firstly, onto the issue of how it gives access to export markets to people living in the developing world. Now, the reason developing countries are developing is because the respective governments fail to provide opportunities for their people. What we have in a poor, protectionist developing country is a walled-in, stifled economy in which people are trapped because they don't have the opportunities. Ladies and gentlemen, what we see is barren markets in which there is a dearth of jobs. People are trapped in a cycle of low demand and low supply, in which they can't prove themselves and use their comparative advantages. So, ladies and gentlemen, the access to a foreign market with a large purchasing power is a huge boost to those people because they can use their ability to prove themselves to the world. An excellent example of this would be China. China joined the WTO in 2001, ladies and gentlemen, and in the 6 years we have seen a great leap forward coming from the Chinese people. According to the US Department of Trade, by manufacturing, China managed to pull up $150 billion from the United States. The fact of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, this $150 billion has changed the lives of the Chinese people. It has uplifted thousands from poverty, and the fact is many people are enjoying a higher quality of life thanks to free trade. Another excellent example of this would be Thailand, ladies and gentlemen, in which, with an open market, the Thai farmers benefited hugely. Now Thailand has become the biggest exporter in terms of rice, and also they are benefiting hugely with exports of shrimps and chicken, ladies and gentlemen. Without free trade, with protectionism, this would never have happened. The Chinese and the Thai people would never have enjoyed the quality of life that they are enjoying right now. So Team Lithuania has to prove to us why the Chinese people and the Thai people who are uplifted from poverty would have benefited under a protectionist system. But ladies and gentlemen, moving on to the second issue about how it provides opportunities to the developing world. Now I'm firstly going to analyse the issue of outsourcing. Now outsourcing is, ladies and gentlemen, when companies move in search of cheap or competent labour to the developing countries. According to the Forrester research, 3.3 million service industry jobs shall move from the United States to countries like China, India, Philippines, providing $130 billion in wages, ladies and gentlemen. $130 billion will be going into the pockets of the poor living in the developing countries. So we say, ladies and gentlemen, in essence, outsourcing brings developing countries opportunities, industries, and hope that they never had, ladies and gentlemen. So let's look at the case study of India, Bangalore specifically, the #1 destination of United States IT industries. Now, when the IT technology moved to Bangalore, this created 2.2 million jobs, ladies and gentlemen, for the Indian youth, which resulted in an 87 billion in profit and a staggering 7.5% increase in GDP. So, ladies and gentlemen, if August 15, 1947 was liberalization for the India, we see that the development of free trade and IT technology was independence for the Indian youth who gained opportunities. But moreover, as I stated before, through outsourcing, there is significant technology transfers which occurs to the developing world. I've already told you about India. This was also the case in Southeast Asian countries in terms of fast food. We saw Jollibee in Philippines and Pizza Company in Thailand develop as a result of McDonald's and Pizza Hut coming into these industries. By learning the ability of US fast food markets, the Southeast Asian fast food industry burgeoned, and now the local companies dominate the domestic market in terms of fast food. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've proven to you in my speech today that free trade opens up opportunities and uplifts thousands and thousands of poor living in the developing world. I've told you that it gives a bigger market, it gives access to foreign markets in which countries can prove their competitive advantage. I've also told you that in terms of labour, many multinationals move into these countries and provide opportunities. It is on these grounds, ladies and gentlemen, on which you're very proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
The speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 6 seconds.
Opposition speaker for a speech. And now, to offer the case for the proposition, microphone Yaba.
Ladies and gentlemen, today the proposition side of the House wants to talk about the real world and about the free trade in a real situation. And actually, as we said in our definitions, which our opponents didn't argue, we said that current free trade agreements actually allow certain amounts of protectionism and they actually allow subsidies. And no matter what World Trade Organization is trying to do, maybe in the future it won't allow this, but current free trade agreements do this. Therefore, we should talk about the current status quo. Now, in my speech, I'm going to concentrate on four main issues. The first one is about this infant industry issue. The second one is about the new marketplaces. The third one is about how free trade boosts or doesn't boost the growth of countries. And lastly, I will introduce our third argument about how free trade widens the gap between rich and poor. So now, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you. Let me talk about the infant industry argument. Well, actually, we said that in developing countries, industries that are young, they are not able to compete with the developed ones. What our opponents actually answered to this, that, well, only those industries that are uncompetitive fail. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we are saying. Those industries are uncompetitive, and therefore, we have to protect them. No, thank you. If we do not protect them, those developing countries will become dependent on the developed ones, and will become dependent from the products of the developed ones, and thus there will be a great chance of manipulation of those countries. No, thank you. Now talking about new marketplaces, well, actually, our opponents say that those huge multinational corporations come into the country and create new workplaces. But ladies and gentlemen, what we are saying is the fact that we do not, while creating those maybe working places, we actually take the jobs from local people who have been working in their small businesses. No, thank you, for all their lives, and they are unable to switch to the new jobs so quickly, and therefore there is this painful transition period that we were talking about. And due to the fact that actually, no thank you, the governments of the developing countries are weak, and we do not have a system of social guarantees, we cannot take care of those people who become jobless, and thus the situation becomes even worse. And actually, ladies and gentlemen, even the countries that are quite developed opposed to those multinational corporations. We could take example of even South Korea, because South Korea a few weeks ago ratified the free trade agreement with the United States of America. And actually, there have been wide protests, and people have been protesting due to the fact that they believe, no thank you, that huge companies from the United States of America will take their jobs, and this will not benefit them. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about, no thank you, whether the free trade boosts the growth of developing countries. Well, actually, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that, first of all, what our opponents were talking about, no thank you, madam, that when multinational companies go to the country, this boosts its economic growth. But actually, ladies and gentlemen, all this growth goes to those multinational corporations. And once again, I would like to use the example of South Korea. It is estimated that although this free trade agreement might boost its growth by 2%, GDP growth by 2%, all this growth will go to those multinational corporations of United States of America rather than the people of South Korea. This is why, this is why we are opposing this, and this is why it is not beneficial. Now, another point that our opponent said is that under the free trade, the countries will be able to use their comparative advantage. But actually, ladies and gentlemen, let's analyze the cases how we can use it. Well, most of the developing countries have comparative advantage in agriculture. But the problem is that actually all the free trade agreements allows countries to subsidize their production. No, thank you. And according to those agreements, United States of America and European Union actually subsidize their production, while weak countries like, for example, Burkina Faso or Argentina are unable to subsidize their production, and thus they become, I'll take you in a moment, and thus we become uncompetitive in the international market. Yes.
Exactly. When countries revert to protectionism, you give the developed nations a chance to arm themselves with subsidies, quota, and tariffs. Under this circumstance, developing countries are no match for these developing nations.
Sir, actually, it's not your speech. You should give me a question. But, okay, but actually, what I'm talking about and what our opponents actually refusing to understand, that those countries have ratified free trade agreements with those countries. For example, Mexico and United States actually have a free trade agreement. No, thank you. But according to this free trade agreement, United States and Mexico are able to use subsidies. However, the difference is that Mexico simply is not economically advanced to use those subsidies, and United States is. This is how it benefits. Now, another way we could use their comparative advantage is turning into using their natural resources. However, the industries on natural resources are not labor intensive. Therefore, it means that you do not need many people, for example, to pump oil. Therefore, people will lose their jobs. No, thank you. While turning into these industries, and as I've shown you, people, those governments are unable to take care of those people who lose jobs. No, thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me move to my argument, which claims that free trade widens the gap between rich and poor. So first of all, how free trade widens the gap on international level? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've already shown you that actually free trade agreements allow certain amount of protectionism, like subsidies. No, thank you. And United States of America and EU spend about $1.4 billion annually for protecting their goods, especially agriculture. And poor countries therefore cannot compete with them. And actually, no, thank you. It is a clear link how free trade is. Those free trade agreements are beneficial only to the developed countries, and most of developing countries even do not want to sign them. No, thank you. But they actually ratify them only because the International Monetary Fund gives them aid, only with the condition that they sign these free trade agreements. And this shows actually that this is not beneficial for the developing countries, but just for developed ones. Now, talking about the increasing the gap between rich and poor on local level, actually we believe that only rich people who are already rich benefit from free trade, because a person needs to be already rich in order to invest successfully in the new markets. What is more, ladies and gentlemen, due to the fact that small businesses cannot compete, and as I've shown you before, and people lose their jobs, and they are not qualified enough to work, for example, in those multinational corporations, or those corporations, as our opponents themselves said, go to the country in order to search for cheap labor. They are often forced to work in harsh conditions, so-called the sweatshops, and this even widens the gap between rich and poor in the country. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, due to these facts, I beg you to propose.
The speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 6 seconds.
opposition speaker for a speech. And now to continue the case for the opposition, I call Arvid Kong.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to look at this matter of free trade, not unilaterally, but in multiple aspects, in comparison with the flawed other, protectionism. And when we do, it becomes unmistakably clear that the side of the opposition has carried this debate home. Free trade has demonstrated so many benefits and represents potential and hope for these developed nations. Now, to begin this speech, I'd first like to affirm our case split. Let's look at what has happened in this debate so far. Our first speaker has pounded our first point that the core reason for much of the economic development in today's world is because of free trade towards the developing community, thereby affirming the act of free trade. Now, I am going to talk about the second half of this argument, that it actually harms these nations when free trade is not implemented, that it stops and reverses progress that they're experiencing currently today, and it's demonstrating harm towards society and the quality of life for these people. And these are the things that I'm going to be talking about today. But before I move on, there are a lot of things that bother me about the Lithuanian case today. Their point, at first I'd like to talk about their stance. Their stance was basically this: we support the free trade, but with a little protectionism. Ladies and gentlemen, a little protectionism is still protectionism, and this is the point that we're trying to affirm today. No, thank you. Now, they talk about how free trade in principle is not going to work. But ladies and gentlemen, we see an increasing trend towards this, such as they talk about NAFTA, which is a good example because in 2004, the WTO actually protected Mexico by affirming that the United States was illegal and using subsidies, which amounted to almost $19 billion for just corn alone. So as you can see, in the fight towards free trade, there's an increasing trend towards this free trade principle. We're not here to debate on whether free trade agreements are going to work in this, are harmful to developing society. We're here to debate on whether free trade is going to harm developing countries, and we can clearly see that it isn't in this debate. Now, the first point about how it impedes growth, it troubles domestic industries, about how it doesn't protect infant industries. Ladies and gentlemen, there's four things I'd like to say about this. First of all, they're not looking at the bigger picture. The blooming industries in India and China, of how it lifted so many people, no thank you, that lifted so many people out of poverty into the middle class, which I'll get to later in my substantive speech. Second, once again, it created new industries that have bloomed and taken over these domestic industries that have proven to be incompetent. Ladies and gentlemen, let's look at India, where the IT industry has demonstrated a significant boom and actually helped the infant industry grow. No, thank you. Second, in terms of what the government is not considering in today's debate, is that in terms of protectionism, if subsidies are allowed, then they don't realize that the other side, the developed countries, are also going to use subsidies. And in this regard, in this case, the developing country will never win. No, thank you. And fourth of all, it impedes development. I'd like to use this example of the Philippines, where they tried to promote a car industry by using protectionism. Just a minute. Where they try to protect the car industry in that nation. But ladies and gentlemen, as we can see, protectionism in that nation hasn't really helped it because the car industry is dead in the Philippines. So as you can see, free trade is actually beneficial in these regards, and protectionism is the one that's harming these nations. Yes?
You said that developed countries will use protectionism, but they are using now subsidies, as we told you. So let's have fair trade.
That's exactly our point. As we can see, ladies and gentlemen, using subsidies is harming these nations. Mexico, in the NAFTA agreement, when they use subsidies, $19 billion to subsidize corn, look at what happened to Mexico. Obviously, the act of protectionism is not working in today's world, ladies and gentlemen. So this completely counters their first point. Their second point about political instability, about suicides in India, that's exactly because of subsidization, because of protectionism. Foreign governments are subsidizing their products. So in principle, it's the protectionism that's killing Indian workers. It's killing the rural population. So that example actually supports our opinion in that regard. So that their only example for political instability has been counted. So that point falls. And their last point about how it's bad for society, no thank you. There's no link between protectionism and how it reduces the gap between the rich and poor. And there's also no link between how implementing free trade actually widens the gap between rich and poor. Actually, in my substantive matter, I'll go to demonstrate how it reduces the gap between the rich and poor. So as you can see, their no thank you, their third point is based on no logic, no correlation, and for this reason it falls.
On the point, sir.
No, thank you. Now I'd like to go into the substantive matter of speech, where I will prove to you the inherent harms and detriments of ending free trade in today's society. But to do so, we need to first understand things like outsourcing and how it works. Outsourcing is what I like to focus on in the first part of my speech, and outsourcing is where companies from a developed nation enter developing countries because of cheap labor, because of assets in that nation that can help it make it more economically feasible and cheaper for these countries. Which leads me to my first argument about how it destroys things like outsourcing, which are actually proving to be extremely beneficial to nations like India and China. Protectionism, ladies and gentlemen, shuts down outsourcing because while the free trade is based on the fact that the product is cheaper, protectionism is based on limiting the number of products through unfair trade barriers, subsidies, restrictions on trade, and all of these things are extremely detrimental to developing nations who cannot compete with developed nations in terms of subsidies and things like that. No, thank you. And by doing so, the developing world loses money and makes the developed world makes these products unfairly cheaper than the developing world. And now to explain this through examples, which I'll go into deep analysis of, I'd like to first point to Thailand, importing millions of tons of shrimp, but because of custom restrictions, it's reducing profits by 90%. Also, you need to realize that it's not just the nations, developing nations, that are going to be using subsidies and protectionism in this regard. Developed nations will retaliate, guaranteed, with subsidies that will which developing countries can never stand up against because of the sheer financial capabilities. NAFTA is another example. Mexican corn was cheaper to produce, but because of subsidies from the American government, protectionism from the American government, no thank you. $19 billion it offset and made American corn cheaper in that regard.
Stop.
And now it's destroying the market, and which the WTO reversed in their decision, no thank you. Also, I'd like to go into the outsourcing. If the government gives subsidies to an industry, then there's really no reason for these these companies to go and outsource in other nations. So what this means is for India, cases like India and China, it completely decimates their industry, which relies on outsourcing. These nations are thriving on the fact that multinational corporations are leaving their borders and coming to nations like China and India to produce. In India, IT. In China, manufacturing. Also call centers in the Philippines. Companies in the United States hire Philippine call centers because of the economic feasibility and the fact that they're much cheaper. And the results have been incredible. But if these companies receive subsidies to pay for hiring workers in the United States, then the Philippine call center industry completely dies down. And as I'll prove later in my speech, it's completely detrimental and devastating to the Philippine economy, which has earned so much from this. And this leads to my second part of the speech about how it adds additional harm to the quality of life within people. Now let's look at the current status quo to just see the extent of what we'll lose if free trade was taken away. On the micro level, I'd like to once again revert to the call center example. Because of call centers, they earn actually more than bank managers in the local industry. And what's happening is communities are growing. Restaurants, industries, little communities are sprouting all over these call center industries because of the affluence, and it's showing, ladies and gentlemen. But if we take away free trade, all of this goes away because the outsourcing industry is no longer competent. On the macro level, because the GDP is growing slower without free trade, ladies and gentlemen, they borrow more. There's lower credit rating. And as a result, they borrow less at a higher interest rate. And in fact, protectionism costs developing nations $100 billion a year, according to the World Bank. Further examples that go to illustrate this point is India, which relies so much on outsourcing from IT industry, and that's only possible without tariffs and subsidies. And as a result, at its present FT status, according to the McKinsey Global Institute, there's a 300% increase in salary, 291 people that can be lifted out of poverty, and 583 million strong that can become the middle-class society. And as my first speaker mentioned, an $87 billion profit. So all of these statistics go to show you the inherent benefits of free trade and the inherent harms and detriments it will cause on the economy if free trade is to be stopped. And for these reasons, we beg to oppose. Thank you.
The speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 22 seconds.
The second opposition speaker for his speech. And now, to continue the case for the proposition, I call upon Lucas
the opposition today is trying to do, they're trying to break the legs of marathon runner and tell him to run and compete with other marathon runners. What we say, this is unfair. We say that this is unfair because developing countries should develop in the same way as developed countries did. And we say that developed countries use the heavy amounts of protectionism, and we are going to prove it. By the way, I would like to say that today the biggest and harshest debate was in the areas of domestic business and about how it's increasing the gap between the rich and the poor. I'm not going to be very original. I'm going to stick to the flow of the debate, so I'm going to address these main issues. But before I do that, I would like to point out several logical fallacies that occurred in our opponent's case. So firstly, correlation does not mean causation, ladies and gentlemen, because they gave us many examples, really nice examples, but when you think into it a bit deeper, you see major flaws. For example, they said that China benefited when they joined World Trade Organization, and that, you know, the GDP just skyrocketed. But ladies and gentlemen, how a country that does not even allow private assets, that does not even have private property, can be regarded as a real free trade country? Furthermore, they are using really huge amounts of protectionism. If I want to invest in China's market, about 25% of my investment will be cut off if I want to retrieve my benefits. So that's one logical fallacy. No, thank you. Another point is that when IT technological companies moved to India, the GDP also skyrocketed. And they said that about 2 million young people got jobs, and GDP just boosted from till 8%. But ladies and gentlemen, if 2 million young people will get jobs, I don't think that the market will get such huge benefits. And another thing, no, thank you. Another thing is that what I'm telling you is that many of that, well, let's say they will get benefits from it. China will get benefits from it, or India, but we say that all those benefits, the large sums, will go to the international corporations, those corporations that are providing job spots and etc. And we have been telling you throughout our cases, first two speeches. Another, the point about weak governments that was presented by the first speaker was not addressed at all. So that is why this point stands. Another thing that our opponents did not fail to realize is that if we use free trade, some amount of protectionism is allowed. And they said that NAFTA, when the US was using NAFTA, Mexico had these huge drawbacks because of NAFTA and because of the subsidies. But now I would like to tell you what NAFTA actually means. North American Trade Agreements. Trade agreements, that is a document of free trade. So they allowed to use subsidies. Furthermore, they said that World Trade Organization is trying, I stress the word, is trying, no thank you, to not allow American people and American farmers to use subsidies. But the fact is, what we have been telling you, we're talking about real world, not about theoretical world of perfect markets. And that is why they are using subsidies right now, and it is a huge drawback for the foreign people. Go on.
The reason NAFTA failed was because the United States went against the WTO. The WTO penalized the United States and defended countries like Mexico and Costa Rica. What do you say about that?
They try to defend them, but they not defend them because the United States, at this point, still uses subsidies. So if they are trying, they're doing a jolly good job. I agree. Try, it is good, but just do not fail to do is try a bit more, and if you will succeed, that will be a very, very good job. I will applaud you. So first, now moving to my point about domestic businesses. So firstly, what we said is that it destroys local businesses because those in those countries, the small family domestic businesses are the ones that take place there. So if we allow international corporations to move there, they have very good expertise, they have really, really long experience, and they have money to advertise their products and etc. So that's why those domestic businesses just disappear. We gave you examples about Jamaica, about how China, about Jamaica milk market. And what we say is that those people whose job spots are destroyed in their small family business are forced to move and join those corporations where they have to work in harsh conditions such as sweatshops and etc. Another point that we said is that the growth that China received and etc. was actually received by those large international companies, and the people, the one that are needing it the most, did not receive any benefits at all. Well, not too big benefits, let's say. Another thing that they say is that look at fast food industry in China. It's very good. We benefited from the international corporation. But ladies and gentlemen, I don't think that opposition is going to save Asia by fast food restaurants, because you know that's not very logical and that's not a very sufficient source of gain. Now I'd like to move and tell you why protectionism is better. All countries, all developed countries at this point, were using protectionism in their early stage of development. And that's precisely what we say, ladies and gentlemen. We're not opposing free trade as a model. It's a very good model. It just does not work. What we say is that let the developing world develop someday, and then they can use free trade as developing countries are using now. And we would like to note, once again, that UK, US, Sweden, Japan, Germany, and etc. use protectionism at their early stage of development. UK used it at the steel industry. US use it in the steel industry. UK use it in their textile industry. Japan in their shipbuilding industry. Germany in their car industry, and etc. etc. So what we say is that those corporations that are trying to take the jobs and that are trying to compete in the now developing world industries, at some point we're protected by their own governments, and we say that we should provide equal opportunities for the developing world. Now, a point about how it widens the gap between the rich and the poor. So we presented you two levels, how it widens the gap between rich and the poor in two levels, international one and domestic one. So let me move to international one. It widens the gap when countries like US and etc. and EU, let's say, subsidizes their markets. For example, a farmer in US, it's cost for him to produce one potato about $2, and he can sell one potato for about $1. And the fact is that government paid him the losses and even more so that he would not bankrupt. And this would be very good if countries like Costa Rica and etc. would have fair opportunities to compete with them. Because in those countries they don't even have social security net and etc. Not even talking about subsidies. So that shows us how it's unfair and how it widens the gap in the international level. Now moving to the local level. I would like to quote British MP George Galloway, who said that now the gap between rich and the poor in London, in England, in the developed country that is using free trade, is even bigger than it was when Dickens wrote Oliver Twist. So it is because rich people are getting richer and poor people are getting poorer. How it's being done. If you want to benefit from free trade, you have to be rich before free trade, because you have to invest in new markets, in new potential markets. And if you don't have money to invest, but you have small domestic business, you will be not able to compete with those large international corporations, and you will lose your job. You will be forced to join them and work in sweatshops and work for pences, ladies and gentlemen. That's why poor are getting poorer and rich are getting richer. So for these two reasons, I beg you to propose.
The speakers go for 8 minutes.
Continue the case for the opposition. Microphone wandering down.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we face a choice of selecting an economic system over the other. And today we face two such systems, that of the free trade model and that of the protectionism model. And this, ladies and gentlemen, weighing the benefits and harms of these two models is the criteria for judging this debate and answering which one is better for the developing world. But before I go into the specifics of my case, let's just have a look at what Team Korea did in today's debate. Our first speakers have shown you that free trade brings benefits and progress to the developing world through trade and outsourcing. My second speaker, Albert, showed you that protectionism will make the developing nations suffer even more and reverse the progress they had. the very progress that Soye outlined in her speech. And as a team, ladies and gentlemen, we have proven that it is free trade rather than protectionism that brings greater benefits for the developing world in the reality. Now, taking into account these arguments, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do two things. I'm first going to give you a comparison of the two models of the trade systems that I've established in my introduction, and then I'm going to ask you a critical question that we have to answer at the end of today's debate. And that question is, which economic system truly makes the developing world a better place to live? And by doing so, I'm going to prove to you that South Korea fulfills the criteria and the burden that we set in the beginning. So let's go on to the first part of my speech and compare the two models of trade that we have established. Now, first of all, we have the free trade. The Lithuanian's first speaker mentioned that developing nations need protectionist measures because they need to protect their infant industries. And as a result, free trade will harm these industries. Now, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, in the first sense, we're only looking at one sector of the economy, judging whether a country benefits or harms, simply by looking at one industry. We need to look at the country as a whole. Today, South Korea proved to you that when you have multinational corporations coming into developing nations, they provide you with millions of jobs that have never existed in these nations. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. They say that these jobs are merely sweatshops, and that they're simply stitching clothes. Ladies and gentlemen, we gave you the example of India, where America came in. They actually created the IT industry, gave 2.2 million jobs to the middle class, and provide them with an age of $130 billion. No, thank you. We can't see this as the growth of MNCs, ladies and gentlemen. This is the growth of India from free trade. We've given you the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that actually free trade goes on to actually create industries, create more opportunities for these people. And we have to notify the fact that these developing nations, ladies and gentlemen, in the status quo, really have nothing much to sustain themselves, ladies and gentlemen. They need the help of these multinationals. They went on to say, ladies and gentlemen, that weak governments are not able to change. But we don't find any causal link between having a weak government and not being able to change, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, countries like Korea and Japan, ladies and gentlemen, in the era of 1950s and 60s, had very weak governments in place. But even if we had weak governments, we were given access to United States markets. And United States multinational corporations came in and transferred technology, especially in the car industry. As a result, ladies and gentlemen, Korea and Japan has grown to be one of the best economies in the world. This is the progress that we face in today's world, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, ma'am.
Actually, but Japan is example of protectionism because we use huge protectionism to
ladies and gentlemen,
digital.
Let's approach this example with deep analysis. What they're saying right here is that Japan had protectionism and thus they developed. Let's have a look at the deeper picture. In the 1950s and 60s, ladies and gentlemen, Korea and Japan had United States military bases in our country. That accounted for the security in our region, and as a result, we had a lot of economic investment. Furthermore, while it is not that we had protectionist measures, but actually the United States government allowed our countries, Korea and Japan, to have access to their markets, access to their car industry, etc. And as a result, it was these factors, not protectionist measures, that made us develop. Now they say that we widened the gap, but according to the United States Bureau of Economic Research, free trade has resulted in reduced gaps and inequality because they reduce the rural and urban wages that people get, allowing for growth and more chance of emerging industries, ladies and gentlemen. And thus, if we take free trade away, we're only going a step backwards to protectionism where we've seen all the harms. Now let's go and assess the benefits of free trade. Free trade, ladies and gentlemen, has proven to create export-based economies. Examples like Korea, China, Thailand, ladies and gentlemen, benefited from this trade, and as a result grew to be one of the strongest nations in Asia today. Furthermore, my first speaker gave you how countries can benefit from outsourcing and have jobs that didn't really exist at all. Now, ladies and gentlemen, they say that the benefits go to the stronger part of society. And we've given you empirical evidence that in India, as a result of free trade, 583 million people was created as the middle class, and they earned $130 billion of wages. This is the evidence of the benefits that we see in today's world. Having dealt with this model of free trade, let's go on to see the protectionism model. They said that we have, ladies and gentlemen, Lithuania today have a wrong picture of what a free trade is. They said that protectionism is already incorporated into the free trade agreements, and as a result, free trade harms them. Ladies and gentlemen, by saying that, they are saying that the application of free trade is harming the countries and not the free trade itself. We have given you evidence that whenever we see an unfair trade practice in the world, within free trade agreements, ladies and gentlemen, especially in NAFTA, the World Trade Organization has taken measures to account for this, to correct for this inequality. Just wait a minute. Examples show that when the United States restricted imports of shrimp products from India, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Thailand, in 2001, the WTO penalized the United States and gave them and imposed an immense fine to penalize them for the subsidies that we have. And these examples simply show you that the situation isn't alleviating and that the free trade is getting better. All they're doing, ladies and gentlemen, is going against the application of free trade and free trade not itself. Yes, sir.
If they were penalized, why are they still subsidizing their agriculture market?
Sir, in NAFTA, when the United States, in 2004, another example, in 2004, when the WTO penalized the United States for giving subsidies to the United States farmers, as a result of that penalization, right now in the status quo, you don't have any more United States subsidies in relation in the NAFTA model, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot have that when you're penalized. The WTO has a mandate, has the power to impose strict regulation in these countries, and these countries, ladies and gentlemen, follow it. So let's go on and ask ourselves a simple question. Which economic system makes the developing world a better place to live? And in order to show you the harms of protectionism, I'm going to ask you what the value of $1 billion is. Ladies and gentlemen, an average farmer in Ethiopia earns $90 per year. In order to make $1 billion, he or she has to work 10,000 years. In the other world, in the United States, farmers are being given $19 billion annually. When you think of this, ladies and gentlemen, when you think of the fact that protectionism also occurs in the developed world at a better rate, at a stronger rate, ladies and gentlemen, you see that these developing nations are in no way a match for the developed nations. We have to see that protectionism occurs within the developing world as well as the developed world. And at the end of the debate, what is it that we seek? We seek a better model for the developing nations. South Korea model, we give you more opportunities, jobs, higher income, better technology, and a real hope for the future. In the Lithuania model, we have developing nations exceeding developed nations exceeding developing nations through protectionism. What model would you choose? It is clearly that of South Korea. Thank you very much.
The speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 25 seconds.
Third opposition speaker for his speech. We now move on to the team's 4-minute concurrent reply speeches. The opposition team will deliver their reply speech first. There are no points of information during reply speeches. After 3 minutes, the timekeeper will signal once to let the speaker know they have 1 minute left. After 4 minutes, the timekeeper will signal twice. To deliver the opposition's reply speech, I call upon Sahi In.
I directly quote the third speaker of the Lithuanian team. Getting jobs, the Indians and the Chinese getting jobs, it wasn't really a big benefit. But the fact of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that Indians, 2.2 million Indians get jobs, and the Chinese people get hired by these multinationals, which Lithuania seems so skeptical about, is the major factor that changes the lives for the people who live in the developing world. And for Team Lithuania to minimize this, saying that this isn't a big benefit for them at all, is extremely preposterous. We say that free trade itself is what gave them hope, jobs, and money, ladies and gentlemen, in the first place, and thus that argument does not stand. Now, after 6 riveting speeches, today's debate basically boils down into 3 major issues. Firstly, the issue of economic growth for these nations. Secondly, the issue of quality of life and the gap between the rich and poor. And thirdly and finally, this final question about whether free trade agreements are evil. So firstly, onto the issue of economic growth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Team Lithuania argued that domestic companies will collapse when free trade begins. But the fact of the matter is we simply refuted this by saying that uncompetitive companies will collapse even under a protectionist system. We told you that developed countries will use protectionism against them anyway. We gave you examples such as Malaysia's proton cars, the Philippine car industry and the sugar industry. They never came back with us, ladies and gentlemen. We actually told you that domestic companies blossom specifically because of the free trade, because multinational companies move in, ladies and gentlemen, and even if they move out eventually, what they leave is technology and people and a middle class, ladies and gentlemen. And this benefits the developing countries hugely. The fact that they get technology transfers and can learn from the superior technology from countries such as the United States, from United Kingdom, is a huge boost for the domestic companies, ladies and gentlemen. But we on the side of opposition told you that actually the economy grows because of free trade. We gave you the fact that export markets grow bigger for developing countries and they get access to a large market which has a huge purchasing power. They never ever responded to this point, ladies and gentlemen. We also told you about outsourcing, how outsourcing gives opportunities and brings a huge economic growth in GDP and also in wages for the people living in developing countries. We gave you the example of India, which had a 7.5%